Subcommittee on National Security will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today's hearing on recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights comes at the dawn of a new horizon in U.S.-Israel relations. The Trump administration has proven to be a staunchly pro-Israel administration. President Trump took the long overdue steps of recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and opening the U.S. Embassy in Israel there this past May. Many presidents had promised to move the embassy, but it was President Trump who kept his promise and delivered. And I would admit that this committee was actively involved in that. We actually have some people who helped testify right before the decision, which I think was very important, so thank you. The President withdrew from the Iran deal that paved the way for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon and provided huge amounts of money in sanctions relief and $1.7 billion in cold, hard cash. He pulled the U.S. out of the anti-Israel UN Human Rights Council, where the world's worst human rights violators routinely vilify the world's only Jewish state. He signed the Taylor Force Act into law, holding the Palestinian Authority accountable for its cash payments to terrorists, and he appointed a truly outstanding ambassador to Israel, my friend David Friedman. The President now has the opportunity to take another major step to advance American interests and to fortify the U.S.-Israel relationship by recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is essential to Israel's security, a strategic high ground along Israel's borders with Syria and Lebanon. The Golan's topography grants Israel with an observation and intelligence capabilities that allow it to detect enemy activities. It also offers incredible defensive advantages in repelling an attack. It allows Israel to defend critical segments of territory like the Sea of Galilee and Haifa Bay, serves as a major water source and as a growing population center. The importance of the Golan is illustrated by Major General Giora Eiland, the former head of Israel's National Security Council, who wrote that, quote, Israel does not possess a plausible solution to its security needs without the Golan Heights, end quote. Israel's need for the Golan Heights is clearer than ever given the threats it currently faces on its northern border. Iran has escalated its aggression against the Jewish state to unprecedented levels in recent months, launching direct attacks on Israel from Syria. In May, Iranian forces in Syria fired approximately 20 rockets at Israeli military positions in the Golan Heights. In February, Iran sent an armed drone into Israeli airspace. Iran has also equipped its terrorist proxy Hezbollah with advanced weapons, including over 100,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. And amidst the chaos of Syria's civil war, terrorist groups, including ISIS, have gained footholds along the Syria border with Israel. We can only imagine how much worse the threats to Israel's north would be, and threats to the security of the broader region would be, if the Golan was in the hands of what remains of the Syrian regime or Iran or Hezbollah or ISIS. It would leave Israel's enemies in control of that high ground and station even closer to Israel's heartland. Now, this past weekend, we saw Hamas launch nearly 200 rockets at Israel, a stark reminder of the consequences of Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. Hamas's latest attack demonstrates why it's so important that Israel keep the Golan Heights. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad's government has launched a ruthless campaign to retake the country's south, backed by Iran and Russia. The Syrian dictator has slaughtered his own people in his desperate bid to cling to power. Countries including the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Canada, as well as the UN, have all made clear that the Assad regime has no legitimacy. The U.S. should push back against Assad and Iran and Russia's expanding influence. President Trump's action in ordering airstrikes made clear that Syria's use of chemical weapons would not be tolerated. The President can further U.S. national security interests and send Assad, Iran, and Russia another strong message with the stroke of a pen by recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan. Recognizing this claim is also the right thing to do. Israel won the Golan in a defensive war in 1967. It repelled another Syrian attack there in 1973. 1981, with the passage of the Golan Heights Law, Israel permanently integrated the area as part of its country, and today the Golan flourishes as a growing center of agriculture, industry, tourism, and wineries. But other nations have yet to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan, despite the fact that its acquisition of the area in a defensive war was consistent with principles of international law. And it's clear that without the Golan, Israel would not have secure and recognized boundaries free of threats or acts of force, as UN Security Council Resolution 242 calls for. By recognizing the Golan as part of Israel, the U.S. would send a clear message that Syrian belligerents will not be rewarded and that Israel's victory over its aggressor has consequences. As Prime Minister Netanyahu said, the time has come after 50 years for the international community to acknowledge that the Golan Heights will permanently remain under Israeli sovereignty and that whatever happens on the other side of the border, that line is not going to change. The case for recognition now is clear. Such a move would bolster Israel against the threats on its northern border and repudiate the Assad regime's butchery and Russia and Iran's designs in Syria. It would recognize the reality that Golan Heights is part of Israel and is vital to its national security. With the current state of Syria, the prospect of peace negotiations is non-existent. But the current danger Israel faces from Iran, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups like ISIS makes clear that, given the instability in the Middle East, Israel could not afford to give up the Golan under any circumstances. Israel's security should be non-negotiable, and so should America's commitment to it. It's time to stand with our ally on the Golan and against these common enemies. This is a policy that the President should implement and that all members of Congress should support. And I would note that we do have a great panel of witnesses here to discuss this issue. So I want to thank all the witnesses for coming and providing their views. Under no circumstance, just think how crazy it would be to say that Israel should give the Golan to Assad or some of these proxies. It would be absolute madness. So let's discuss this issue today. And before we hear from our witnesses, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank this esteemed panel of witnesses. Most of you are frequent flyers to this committee, and we appreciate your advice and words of wisdom. During my time here in this Congress, especially in my role as ranking member on the Subcommittee on National Security, I've labored mightily to maintain the proper decorum, sense of decorum, and chosen my words carefully to avoid vitriol and the harmful rhetoric that sometimes infuses the arguments of the extremes of each of the parties. I've done so in the hope of providing an open channel across the aisle for the meaningful and thoughtful dialogue to take place that is necessary to move this country forward. This morning, I am compelled by that same sense of decency and concern for our national security to briefly comment on the President's remarks in Helsinki yesterday. Yesterday, for me, was a moment of national embarrassment. And I feel the President's words and positions taken constitute a physical injury upon the national security of this country. I only have two recommendations, quite briefly. One is to reassure the men and women who serve this country in our intelligence agency continue to do the work necessary to keep our country safe. We value the work that is being done by our national intelligence agencies. We want them to continue that work. The second recommendation I have is a return to fact-based decision-making in this country. Push back on the ideology and the rhetoric that comes from the extreme ends of each party. Look at the facts and the intelligence that our hardworking, brave women and men in the intelligence agency bring us. A return to fact-based decision-making will help this country, will make us stronger. In regards to the matter before us on the Golan, it's I suppose not unusually, very, very tumultuous time in the region. And we should make sure that whatever actions we take enhance the national security of Israel and the United States and our allies. Again, a return to fact-based decision-making based on the facts on the ground in and around the Golan. Mr. Issa from this committee and I spent a week, maybe 10 days in the Middle East a couple of weeks ago, meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, King Abdallah, meeting with leadership in Bahrain, with President al-Sisi in Egypt, to talk about this confluence of events and the instability that has been brought about by the collapse of ISIS, the presence of numerous militia, so-called rebels in Syria, the advancements being made by Bashar al-Assad and his troops, supported by Hezbollah, and the presence of Iranian militia in an area so close to Israel. There has been an armistice, a truce in place around the Golan since 1974. And we must be sure that any steps we take as a body to annex the Golan officially at this moment does not precipitate something that is inimical and harmful to the national security of Israel and of our allies in the region, including, of course, our own country. So I think it's a time, again, to return to fact-based decision-making with careful consideration to the facts on the ground in that area. But I think it's a worthwhile discussion, and I'm eager to hear from our witnesses. And again, I thank the Chairman for holding this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. We have Dr. Michael Doran, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Ambassador Dori Gold, President of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, Northwestern University School of Law, Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, the S. Daniel Abraham Professor in Middle Eastern Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, and Mort Klein, President of the Zionist Organization of America. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So if you can please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows the remaining time during your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. And with that, we'll recognize Dr. Doran for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me speak today. It's an honor to appear before you on such a consequential issue in our national security. Mr. Chairman, the question of the Golan is part of a larger strategic problem. The Syria that will emerge from this devastating civil war will look nothing like the one we knew in 2011 when it began. This simple fact raises a big question. What is the Syria that we would like to see emerge from this conflict? What is the Syria that will best contribute to international peace and stability? That question is too big to answer here today, but we can tackle one piece of it. This war should lead to the United States recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Anyone truly concerned with international peace and security must conclude that this change is in the best interest of everyone, with the exception of the Iranian regime and its allies, and it is manifestly in the interest of the United States. In my written testimony, I gave 6 reasons why this is the case. Here I will summarize just 4 of them. First of all, it passes the test of the laboratory of real life. The last 70 years constitute the laboratory of real life, and its results are incontrovertible. When in the hands of Syria, the Golan Heights promoted conflict. When in the hands of Israel, they have promoted stability. Before the 1990s, the Syrian government refused to talk to Israel. Since the 1990s, it has unwaveringly demanded that Israel must withdraw to the line of 4 June 1967. This line would place the Syrians once again on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and it would place them atop the Golan Heights, peering down at Israeli villages below. It would create a wedge of Syrian territory between Israel and Jordan to the south of the Sea of Galilee. The practical choice before us, therefore, is whether to support the permanent acquisition of the Golan Heights by Israel or to continue to whet the appetite of the Syrian regime for the acquisition of that territory. Between 1949 and 1967, literally thousands of clashes erupted between the two sides. By contrast, ever since Israel took control of the Golan Heights in June 1967, they have served as a natural geographic buffer between the two belligerents. The American interest, the interest of peace and security more generally, militates in favor of it remaining in Israeli hands. The second reason, containing Iran. From the outbreak of the Civil War, Iran and Russia have worked aggressively and brutally to shape a new Syria that will serve their interests. The influence of Iran is particularly worrisome because in the division of labor between Moscow and Tehran, Iran provides much of the ground forces. If Israel were to withdraw from the Golan Heights, Iranian forces would replace them. Mr. Chairman, ask yourself a few simple questions. Would any responsible American statesman ever choose to place Iranian soldiers on the Golan Heights so that they could peer down through their rifle scopes at Jewish civilians below? Is there any American interest that would be served by allowing Iran to have direct access to the Sea of Galilee, Israel's primary water reservoir? Would it ever be wise to place Iranian troops on the southern shores of the sea, where its territory would serve as a wedge between Jordan and Israel? The answer to all of those questions, obviously, is no. The third reason, the inherent instability of Syria. The risk of returning the Golan Heights to Syria is not simply a function of the current geopolitical alignment of the Assad regime. It is difficult to imagine at this moment, but it is not impossible that in the future, a pro-American regime could emerge in Damascus and seek peace with Israel. Even then, however, it would still be too risky to return the Golan, because Syria, by its nature, is inherently unstable. The conflict we are witnessing today is but the latest and the worst episode in a history of political chaos that has afflicted the country since its independence. Even if a regime favorable to the United States were to one day emerge in Damascus, we could never count on it to survive. The laboratory of real life teaches us that if we want the Golan Heights to serve as a reliable buffer between Syria and Israel and between Syria and Jordan, we must leave them in the hands of the Israelis. Lastly, aligning diplomacy with reality. We must recognize a simple fact. Israel is never going to withdraw from the territory, and for very good reason. Not recognizing this reality is diplomatic malpractice. Failing to recognize obvious truths is bad for nations in the same way that it is bad for individuals. It creates delusions that take increasing amounts of psychological and material resources to sustain. Pretending that it is still 1973 and that we recognize a Syrian claim to the entire Golan, when in reality we do not, is not simply a diplomatic nicety. It is a formal invitation to the very real Iranian army in Syria and the very real Iranian Hezbollah proxy to continue a campaign of low-intensity warfare to reclaim the occupied Golan. Whose interest is served by the United States adopting stances that lend credence to the claims of Iran and Hezbollah, to the claim that Israel is occupying Syrian land? Certainly not the American interest, certainly not Israel's or Jordan's, and it is not in the interest of the Syrian people themselves who benefit from the stability that the Golan buffer provides. Refusing to recognize reality serves only the interests of Iran, Hezbollah, and Bashar al-Assad. Why should the United States expend very real political capital to help those hostile entities improve their strategic position against the United States and its allies? In sum, recognizing reality will deny oxygen to our enemies and strengthen our allies, precisely what a sound foreign policy should seek to achieve. Thank you once again. It's been a great honor to address you.
Thank you. Ambassador, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening today's hearing.
Can you move the mic just a little bit closer? There you go. Perfect. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening today's hearing. Mr. Lynch, thank you as well. A discussion about the Golan Heights today might seem baffling. Increasingly in recent years, many Israelis have expressed a huge sigh of relief that previous rounds of Israeli-Syrian negotiations did not result in an Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights. They basically didn't go anywhere. These Israelis imagine that had these earlier talks been concluded on Syrian terms, then in 2011, with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, the forces of Jabhat al-Nusra, Daesh, that is ISIS, not to mention Assad's own ruthless army, would have been sitting along the coastline of the Sea of Galilee with their weapons aimed at the city of Tiberias across the lake. What has changed today is that with the imminent victory of the forces of Bashar al-Assad in the sector of South Syria, new diplomatic initiatives by outside actors cannot be ruled out. Already in March 2016, the UN's Special Envoy on Syria, Staffan de Mistura, proposed a paper called Essential Principles of a Political Solution in Syria. The first point of his 12-point paper specifically called for, quote, the restoration of the occupied Golan Heights, unquote, to Syria. This past February at the Valdai Conference in Moscow, which I attended and I spoke at, Vitaly Naumkin, the leading Russian authority on Syria, insisted that Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights could not be accepted. He raised doubts about its very legality. What has changed today is that with the imminent victory of the forces of President Assad, these types of voices will increasingly be heard. Traditionally, the Golan Heights has been the front line for Israel's defense in the north. Israel faced acute asymmetry in active duty forces against Syria. This meant that in 1973, Israel had to withstand an attack by 1,400 Syrian tanks with only 177 tanks on its side. Israel planned on a strategic line of volcanic hills, known in Hebrew as Kavatilim, that helped it to withstand any Syrian assault until Israel's reserve mobilization was complete. What are Israel's potential sources of concern that make the Golan critical for Israel's security today? First, given the proclivity of Middle Eastern regimes to spend their resources on military acquisitions, the eventual recovery of the Syrian army must be anticipated despite its current weaknesses. In light of Russia's role in saving the Assad regime, massive Russian arms transfers to the Syrian armed forces will likely provide the basis for the renewal of Syrian military power. But there is a second source of concern for Israel: Iran's conversion of Syria into a satellite state that will host Iranian forces and bases. In addition, Tehran has been creating Shiite proxy militias modeled on the basis of Lebanese Hezbollah, using manpower from a number of countries, including Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan, to take up positions in Syrian bases. The Iranians have deployed elements from the Fatamyun division, which is made up of Afghan Shiite refugees. As reported as recently as July 11th, Hezbollah and Iran-handled Shiite militias are integrated into the Syrian army in its campaign to take control of South Syria. Iran founded a Syrian branch of Hezbollah in 2014. A year earlier, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, General Qasem Soleimani, proposed unifying many of the various proxy forces and creating a 150,000-man army for operations in Syria. These units have operated under the command of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Many were active in the battle for Aleppo, and now in Daraa, in southern Syria, right next to the Golan Heights. Iran's military goal is to create a land corridor from Iran itself across Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean, which will help it unify its various fronts and establish its hegemony over the Middle East. It will aid Iran to advance the encirclement of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. It will also provide it with an assured line of supply to Syria and to Lebanon as its military presence grows. Locally, Iran seeks to link southern Lebanon and the Golan Heights. But there could be other objectives as well for Soleimani's army. Recently, Hossein Salami, the deputy commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, declared that the Islamic army in Syria, now operating in the Golan Heights, was awaiting orders to eradicate, let me repeat that, eradicate the evil regime of Israel. He used the Farsi word mahavi, meaning annihilation or to make extinct. He added that the Zionist regime has no strategic defensive depth. Hence, this goal was achievable. Even if this statement was motivated by the need for rhetorical flourish, it nonetheless demonstrates the general intent of Iran to use the Golan region for offensive operations against Israel. It would be folly for the state of Israel in any case to ignore statements of this sort by Tehran, especially when they are backed by concrete actions. I'm now reaching my conclusions. Israel today is under assault by a self-declared Iranian-led axis of resistance, which has been operating under Russian protection. As the Syrian state recovers from the Syrian civil war, its allies can be expected to make demands on its behalf, like the return of the Golan Heights to Syria. In fact, these demands have already been voiced. The strongest rebuttal to this effort would be the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. This would demonstrate conclusively that those who use force to threaten their neighbors will not benefit in the court of international diplomacy. States today have a choice. They can back the demands of Iran and its supporters, or they can recognize the rights of Israel in the Golan Heights. U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty would set an important example for others. 3 United States administrations consistently, in written letters of assurance to Israel, confirmed that they envisaged, at the end of the day, Israel must remain on the Golan Heights. That core bipartisan principle of past U.S. policy cannot be realized in the long term without Israeli sovereignty over the Golan confirmed.
Thank you. Well, your written statement will do it. We're over here, so let me get out to Professor Kantorovich for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, honorable members of the committee, I'm honored to speak here with you today about the question of American recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, an issue which I have examined in some detail in my academic work. Foreign policy tries to be reality-based, and it tries to be interest-based. For the past 50 years, the clear reality has been Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and everybody agrees that the Israeli presence there is certainly in U.S. interests, in Israeli interests. Nobody's calling for an Israeli withdrawal in present circumstances. Nobody in U.S. policy circles. So the question is, why not recognize and give status, give legal status to the happy status quo? Why not recognize Israeli sovereignty? It is generally not the U.S. practice to not recognize the sovereign borders, the claimed sovereign borders of countries with whom it has diplomatic relations. The principal rationale for not recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights is a legal one. It's the claim that Israel's acquisition of the Golan was illegal, and thus the U.S. can't recognize it, even if it is indeed happy with the status quo as a policy matter. That legal argument is inaccurate, as I will now describe. The centerpiece of the argument is the axiom that territory cannot be acquired by force. And that is a broad-stroke description of a legal rule, which is generally accurate but lacks important nuance and detail which applies to the present case. The basic prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force is a fairly new one. It comes from the UN Charter. The UN Charter, of course, bans the aggressive use of force as an instrument of state policy. Article 2.4 bans aggression. As a corollary, it's easy to infer that if you're not allowed to attack your neighbors aggressively, you're not allowed to keep what you seize in a war of aggression. That's because the underlying war is illegal. So if you do something illegal, you cannot keep the poisoned fruits. But not all war is illegal. The UN Charter also makes clear that just as aggression is fundamentally illegal, self-defense is fundamentally legal and an inherent right of nations. If the underlying war is legal, there is no reason to infer the corollary that territorial change resulting from such war would be illegal. Thus, in a defensive war, acquisition of force may well be legal. Now let us examine what the status of this principle was in 1967, because we need not ask what is the status of the legality of defensive conquest today, because we need to ask what was the status in 1967 when the relevant events occurred. And it's very easy to find out what the status of this rule was in 1967. You go and see what people were saying about it in 1967 and before 1967. First of all, it's important to note state practice under the UN Charter. After the passage of the UN Charter, it was not the case that the countries that joined the Charter said defensive conquest is out the window. Indeed, most countries of Europe that were part of the victorious Allied cause redrew their borders to the detriment of the defeated Axis powers after the adoption of the UN Charter. Countries like Holland, France, Russia, Greece, all acquired territory from their defeated neighbors in the 1940s as a result of World War II. They were well aware that this would raise a question what the legal basis was, and in discussions at the UN, the answer was quite clear. Those territorial changes are not precluded by the UN Charter because the underlying war was legal and defensive on the part of the Allies. This continued into the 1950s. Today, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, has territory, controls territory north of the 38th parallel. Prior to the Korean War, the territory under South Korean control was entirely south of the 38th parallel, and as a result of its victory in the defensive Korean War, it took some territory north of the 38th parallel, which the US treats for all purposes as sovereign Korean territory. Certainly, we would not wish to suggest the existence of a rule that would require the US to reconsider the sovereign status of territory on the Korean Peninsula, currently regarded as belonging to the Republic of North Korea, and transfer it somehow to the north. Similarly, the views of academics, leading jurists, and the United Nations experts itself before 1967 clearly reflected the allowance of conquest in a defensive war. This issue was discussed in some detail by the United Nations International Law Committee, which was created by the United Nations to formulate a more precise legal draft describing what the UN Charter requires in some detail. The document they came up with specifically addressed the question of territorial change and made clear that territorial change in war is only illegal when the war is itself, when the conduct of the hostilities is in violation of the UN Charter. And of course, the UN Charter recognizes the inherent right of self-defense. Similarly, scholars before 1967 in the leading treatises
Can you just wrap it up and then we'll go?
Absolutely.
Because I just want to get everyone in. We got members here that want to ask questions.
Scholars recognized that there was no prohibition against defensive conquest, and Resolution 242 did not require Israel to withdraw from all territories, again recognizing this principle. Members of the committee, Chairman, Honorable Ranking Member, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ambassador, you're up.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. Drawing on 3 decades of experience in the United States Foreign Service, including 4 years serving in Israel during the 1980s in the Reagan administration, and then 4 more years as President George W. Bush's ambassador to Israel, my analysis and recommendation on this issue is rooted in 2 questions. First, is there a compelling American interest that would be advanced by recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights? Second, would recognition of Israeli sovereignty materially enhance Israeli security? Let me start with the bottom line. The answer to both questions, I believe, is no. I believe that our national security interests counsel in favor of maintaining our existing policy with respect to Israel, Syria, and the Golan Heights. That policy includes strong and determined support for Israel's serious and legitimate security concerns, support for Israel's humanitarian assistance to victims of the conflict in Syria, and maintenance of the status quo with respect to the status of the Golan Heights themselves. The threats to Israel from Syria are real. Since the start of the civil war in 2011, the Syrian regime and its allies, Iran, Iranian proxies, and Hezbollah, have threatened Israel's security from across the separation of forces line that was agreed between Israel and Syria in 1974. In the face of these threats, Israel's policy has been restrained and nuanced. Israel has made clear that it has no interest to interfere in Syria's internal struggles. Israel has made equally clear that it would act as necessary to safeguard its security in response to threats emanating from Syrian territory. Both elements of this Israeli policy were reiterated last week by Prime Minister Netanyahu before and during his visit to Moscow. The United States has wisely supported Israel's actions to defend itself, including the interdiction of Iranian arms shipments to Hezbollah via Syria, attacks targeting Iranian arms depots and installations, and disruption of efforts by Iran and its proxies to establish a permanent military presence in Syria. None of these essential actions by Israel would be enhanced by U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Israel's current policy and actions, in fact, have garnered wide understanding and support. Changing the subject now to Golan's legal status would change the discourse in the region, including among Arab states that are drawing closer to Israel in the face of common threats to their own security. Indeed, a change in U.S. policy would put the focus on this issue, instead of where it belongs, on the murderous actions of the Syrian regime and the support provided to Syria by Iran and Russia. As we all know, the issue of Golan sovereignty is nowhere near the top of the Middle East's overburdened agenda. What sense, therefore, does it make to focus on this issue now? It is also important to recall that Prime Ministers Rabin, Peres, Netanyahu, Barak, and Olmert have all conducted open or secret peace talks with Syria in the past that included the status of Golan as one of the central agenda items. Notwithstanding Israel's 1981 legislation that extended Israeli law, jurisdiction, and administration to the Golan Heights, Prime Minister Rabin's policy, articulated in 1993, has de facto been adopted by all of these prime ministers since then. That is, Israeli willingness to meet Syria's requirements on territory if Syria were ready to meet Israel's requirements on security, water, and the nature of peace. To be sure, I do not advocate the resumption of peace talks now, and surely do not advocate any change in the status quo on Golan. But it also makes no sense to introduce this sovereignty issue now in the midst of the volatile situation in Syria. Since 1967, the United States has considered Golan to be occupied territory, covered by the provisions of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. And the United States has also been sensitive to Israel's legitimate security needs, as reflected in the 1975 letter sent by President Gerald Ford to Prime Minister Rabin and reiterated later by subsequent administrations. Finally, the United States has a fundamental, long-standing interest in supporting the territorial integrity of states, even those we don't like. Syria has a very long way to go before it can reconstruct its politics, society, and economy and take its place among the civilized nations of the world. But the Syrian case does not offer a justification for changing American policy on this crucial principle. I will close by emphasizing again that the United States must continue to support Israel's security actions designed to protect its citizens from attacks emanating from Syria. And the United States must work with Israel and others to ensure that Iran, Iranian proxies, and Hezbollah do not establish military bases in Syria from which to threaten Israel. These are the challenges for the United States policy and for Israel on which we should be working together and with others. Thank you.
Thank you. Mort Klein, you're up for 5 minutes.
Yes, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing. First, I simply wanted to say that Rabin also promoted the Oslo agreements, which turned out to be a disaster. Sharon promoted the gas withdrawal, which turned out to be a disaster. And now these and other top experts understand that giving away any part of Syria won't work, that the Arabs are not in any way interested in peace. The polls show overwhelmingly 5-1 the Israelis oppose giving up the Golan. Israeli control. First of all, I'm going to emphasize 3 quick areas: security, historic, and legal. Israeli control over the western 2/3 of the Golan is a key bulwark against radical regimes and affiliates that threaten the security, stability of the U.S., Israel, the entire Middle East, and beyond. The Golan Heights consist of a strategically located high ground, provides Israel with an irreplaceable ability to monitor and take countermeasures against the growing threats at or near the Syrian-Israel border. These growing threats include the extremely dangerous hegemonic expansion of the Iranian, Syrian, even Russian and North Korea axis, and the presence in Syria, close to the Israeli border, of terrorist groups like the Iran Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Forces, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Syrian forces, and radical Sunni Islamist groups as well. The Iranian regime is attempting to build an 800-mile land bridge to the Mediterranean, running through Iraq and Syria. Among other things, this would enable Iran to obtain naval ports far from Iran's mainland that enhance Iran's ability to deliver advanced weaponry and support to Hezbollah and Iran's other proxies that wreak terror throughout the world. This major strategic threat makes it more important than ever to shore up Israel's position in the Golan. Several times during the recent past, Israel has intercepted drones launched and controlled from Syria with the assistance of Iranian Quds forces. In February, surface-to-air missiles in Syria shot down an Israeli F-16 fighter jet. Such alarming recent incidents confirm the presence of the Iranian front in Syria and vividly demonstrate the necessity for assuring Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. America's moderate Sunni Arab allies would very likely be pleased by the U.S. recognition of the Israeli sovereignty in the Golan, in that this would help stem Iranian aggression and the very same terrorist actors confronting our moderate Arab allies. Indeed, this very past May, after the Iranian Quds Force launched 20 rockets from Syria into Israel, and the Israeli Air Force responded by striking dozens of military targets in Syria that belonged to Iran's Quds forces, the Arab Islamic country of Bahrain issued a public statement supporting Israel's right to defend herself by destroying the sources of danger, and Bahrain criticized Iran for using its missiles to destabilize the region. The necessity for recognizing Israel's retention of the Golan was dramatically demonstrated during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Israel's presence in the Golan provided Israel with strategic depth that enabled forces to assemble and push back Syria's initially effective surprise invasion. Without the Golan, Syrian forces could have overrun Israel in a nightmare scenario. And today, with even more sophisticated weaponry that are held by these groups, it's even more important that Israel can never give away the Golan. Because Israel is our front line in the war to defeat radical Islamist terror, it is surely in America's self-interest to ensure that Israel maintains and enhances her ability to defend herself and defeat these anti-American, anti-West terrorists. In sum, bolstering Israel's sovereignty of the Golan by conferring formal U.S. recognition serves U.S. national security interests. Therefore, it is eminently sensible to agree to Prime Minister Netanyahu and Vice President Pence's urging U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. It also would send a message to Syria and the Palestinian Authority and the Arab world. The jig is up. If you don't change your behavior, if you don't stop terrorism. If you refuse to negotiate, you will be held accountable, and you will lose all support for your demands. There are, moreover, no possible security arrangements that can substitute the topographical advantages and early warning stations, locations, and strategic depth provided by Israel's attention to Golan. Israel will lose 4 of its 5 early warning stations if it gives up the Golan. Moreover, it's the right thing to do. Israel has the strongest ancient and modern historical claims evidenced by numerous archaeological finds, including dozens of ancient Jewish synagogues in the Golan, villages and towns in the Golan Heights. They found Israeli Jewish coins in the Golan, and in fact, even in those who believe in the Bible, it was promised to Abraham in the Bible. The Golan Heights was promised in Deuteronomy 4:43. Israel also has a legal right to the Golan, stemming from the Golan's inclusion in the 1922 League of Nations mandate, agreed to by the U.S. in an international binding treaty. This mandate required Britain to hold the area in trust for the establishment of reestablishment of a Jewish homeland, but Britain unlawfully traded the Golan to the French for rights to the Iraqi oil fields. I have here a picture, it's very important, of the 1920 Balfour Declaration that includes the Golan to be part of Israel. Even after they gave up 80% of Palestine, Golan Heights in the 1922 decision was still part of Israel. U.S. recognition of Israel's security, sovereignty over the Golan would implement a U.S. treaty obligation that has been U.S. law for 93 years, and it would help rectify Britain's 95-year wrong. During the 21 years when Syria controlled the Golan, there was no peace. Israel protects the lives and religious rights and sites of all faiths in the Golan. Moreover, its field hospitals, humanitarian assistance to Syrian victims shows how important it is. Plus, it would be a humanitarian nightmare to move 30,000 Jews and 20,000 Druze out of the Golan. Further,
More, you're out of time. I want to get to questions. I know we're going to have a lot for all you guys, so let me now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Doran, you do think that U.S. recognition of the Golan would further U.S. national security interests, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And why?
Because it promotes stability in the region, and it's a buffer against all of the malignant forces, whether it's Iranian or Sunni jihadi forces, or simply the forces of the Assad regime that seek to overturn the American order in the region and to upset our allies, including Jordan.
And if the administration were to do that, it would certainly be a way to push back against terrorism, Iran, Assad, and Russia, correct?
Absolutely. It would send a message to all of our allies that we are serious about defending the order that is that's under threat. And we would be doing a favor to our allies. May feel compelled to protest. I think the protest, I disagree with Ambassador Kurtzer. I don't think we will change the agenda. The major agenda item in the region is the growth of the Iranian Russian alliance and its effort to overturn the existing order. I think we'll have a day of protest about the Golan, and then it will be forgotten.
Ambassador Gold, would this be in Israel's national security interest to have U.S. recognition of the Golan?
I believe U.S. recognition of Israel's sovereignty on the Golan would unquestionably be in Israel's security interest. Look, everyone talks about Israeli forces staying on the Golan Heights. That's in the famous Ford letter from 1975, repeated again by James Baker's letter before Madrid, repeated again by Warren Christopher's letter to Israel. So that concept is a bipartisan concept. Now let's use our minds for a minute. How do you keep Israeli forces on the Golan Heights if people think it's Syrian sovereign territory? I mean, I don't think a seminar at Harvard Law School could figure this one out. I think—
Well, that actually may be the last place you'd want to figure it out,
Okay.
but that's neither
But
here nor there.
what I am saying is
And I
the
speak
best
from
way to
experience.
assure—
As a Harvard guy, I got to object to that.
the best way to assure that is to do the logical thing and assure Israeli sovereignty, and that will protect the Israeli military presence that almost everybody agrees must be continued, particularly when you're at the end of a war in Syria where a number of countries are now going to come and say, okay, how do we create a new order in Syria? we get rid of the Israelis in the Golan. Prevent it, establish Israeli sovereignty.
Professor, if people disagree with what your analysis, isn't that basically saying that you can commit acts of aggression and not really pay a price for it?
Quite the opposite.
Well, no, the people who disagree with you are saying that countries can commit acts of aggression and not end up paying a price for it, right?
That's exactly right. The notion that defensive conquest would be prohibited, and for example, that Israel's control of the Golan is only temporary, is in effect an insurance policy for aggressors, because they know if they attack a neighboring country, maybe they'll succeed, and at least they'll break even if a country is properly occupying territory of an aggressor. They have to give it back at some point. And what that does is incentivizes not just aggression, but also a failure to make peace. Because a regime like Damascus will know that they will not lose territory by attacking. And even 50 years of failure to make peace, they could still get the territory back.
Mr. Klein, you were here when we did our embassy investigation and hearing last year. A lot of people were saying, oh, you know, it's not the right time, you know, you can't do it. But that was a very successful decision and successful move. I think most of us look at that now. Don't we have a lot of momentum right now to continue leading, have the U.S. administration lead on some of these issues and make a lot of progress? So to me, now's the perfect time to do this.
Yes, also, it was predicted that the Palestinian Authority would have a rage of terrorist attacks, which never developed. I think because America is showing the strength, now you see in Iran demonstrations condemning Palestine. There's no such country, but the Palestinian Authority. And this is really a time to continue and send a message that the jig is up. We will not be supporting your demands that are not only erroneous, but not support your demands when you continue to promote terrorism, you continue to refuse to negotiate with Israel, and I think this will be yet a further step in that realm where the Arab world will get a very powerful message supported by the moderate Arab countries, I believe, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and UAE.
Thank you. My time's expired. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all again. Ambassador Kurtzer, let me rephrase or let me repeat Professor Kontrovich's question. No one is calling for Israeli withdrawal from the Golan. Why not support the happy status quo?
Congressman, that's exactly right, and that's exactly been American policy since 1967. In 1975, when President Ford did send a letter to Prime Minister Rabin, which was reiterated later on, it recognized Israel's very significant security interests. And what that letter said was that at the time when Israel and Syria would try to reach an agreement on the status of the Golan Heights, the United States would give great weight to Israel's position of remaining. It did not declare support for sovereignty, because that would be denying the two parties the ability to make their own sovereign choices. So we had a smart policy in 1975, and that policy has continued until today. The key issue, and I go to the Chairman's first question to Dr. Duran, is how does this serve American national interests? And the answer is it does not, because it would in fact change the discourse from focusing on Israeli security to focusing on this question when it needs not happen now.
Right. I've had an opportunity several times to visit the Golan, going back to my days in the State Senate in Massachusetts. I do recall having dinner with a family in Tiberias, and the Golan is looming over that entire city or town. So there is a palpable need for security in that area. And the letters from, you know, Gerald Ford and I think it was Warren Christopher and others have repeated this narrative that the Golan is necessary to, you know, Israeli forces in the Golan are necessary to Israel's security because of the actions that have taken place there, and it is real, it is necessary, it is important. My worry is that instead of the happy status quo where the Golan and areas there that are vulnerable are protected, we change the narrative to, away from one of Israeli defense to one where we're overreaching, the United States. And in the circumstances that we have right now, I mean, the reports this morning, we've got, they're saying hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the conflict between the rebels and the forces of Bashar al-Assad and Iranian militia and Russian air cover are fleeing into the area next to the Golan. So do we want to change that narrative? Do we want to change the one of supporting Israel's right to defend itself to one where the talk is Israel's annexing the Golan in violation of the previous agreement that's been in place since 1974, at least, if not to 67? Do we want to change that narrative?
Congressman Lynch, I think you're exactly right. The issue now is one of garnering support internationally through our diplomacy, through our work in various fora, support for Israel's security requirements. And that's becoming more successful as many in the Arab world see a common threat emanating from Iran. You would not find Arab support for the recognition of Israeli sovereignty in Golan. And if the subcommittee wants to test that proposition, invite the ambassador of Bahrain, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia and Egypt to a hearing and ask them to declare publicly that they think it would be a good idea. If they say it is, then I'd be happy to tell the subcommittee that I'm wrong. I don't think they're going to make that statement publicly.
Right. The other aspect of, and I have great respect for the professor, this idea that military conquest transfers the rights to ownership. That means that whoever wins the last war, has the right, the legitimate right for that territory. Especially in the Middle East, that's a dangerous, dangerous proposition. And it's one that I don't think following that policy leads to a safe and secure and a peaceful Middle East or a safe and secure Israel either. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
You want to respond before I recommend?
Just one comment.
Well, let me ask. Let's give the professor just a minute, a quick, be short, and then I'm going to recognize Mr. Heiss.
Mr. Lynch, quick clarification of the position being outlined here. It is not that territory can be taken in any war, or even in most wars. It is that when a country that is itself attacked in the exercise of its self-defense changes the frontiers. Now, we recognize that self-defense is legal, so we need to make that judgment. We believe we can make that judgment, that we can tell Crimea apart from the Golan. And if we can't tell aggression from defense, if it all looks the same, then the entire basis of the UN Charter's security system is undermined.
Right. But and I totally respect that. But even in today's testimony, we've gone back to the Bible. So every nation in the Middle East at some point can claim that they were the victim of aggression. Do you see where that leads? Especially in this area. We go back to the books of Deuteronomy and, it just, the right of possession of the Golan as presented to Abraham. It's just, it's never ending if you apply that rule in this region because of the history, that's all. And I totally respect your scholarship and your willingness to come here and help us with our work. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Yields back. The chair notes the presence of the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, a member of the full committee. We thank you for your interest in this topic, and without objection, we welcome him to participate fully in today's hearing. Seeing no objection, it's so ordered. And the chair also notes the presence of Congressman Perry of Pennsylvania. We appreciate your interest in this topic and welcome your participation. I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Perry be permitted to fully participate in today's hearing. Without objection, it's so ordered. Same with Mr. Lamborn. I would like the same unanimous consent. Without objection, it's so ordered, and the Chair will now recognize Mr. Heiss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Gold, how important was President Trump's decision to move the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem? Turn on your mic, please.
Well, that's not the subject today formally. It was extremely important and extremely appreciated by the vast majority of the people of Israel.
And we were told that it would create all sorts of havoc in the region, and it didn't do so. It seems to me that the same basic principles apply here as we're discussing Golan. So I think the point of that move being very positive in every way without creating the fear and the turmoil that was expected by some is a valid point for what we're doing now. Now we have Assad's regime, a campaign in southern Syria, obviously threatening Israel's sovereignty. What are the implications of that?
Well, again, the current campaign, which Assad's people say is to recover Syrian territory from ISIS, is really part of a much wider effort of the Iranian axis, which they call themselves the axis of resistance, to establish this land bridge across the Middle East, which will enshrine Iranian hegemony in the region. That should be our point of departure. And, you know, if some Arab states are not willing to come to this committee and extol the idea of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, it's because our diplomatic work, and I was involved in Golan negotiations for the State of Israel. I was involved in contacts with the Arab states. You can reach agreements quietly, but not publicly on a lot of sensitive issues. I don't believe that suddenly Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the UAE would downgrade their relations with the United States because the United States recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli sovereign territory. To the contrary, you would be serving the interest of the anti-Iranian group among the Middle Eastern states.
Exactly, and that's why we have a role of leadership in this whole question. So how would the question of Golan sovereignty factor into what currently Syria is doing?
Well, there would no longer be a question mark about the Golan Heights, that if the Syrians could launch a surprise attack and seize some territory, they could move a diplomatic process that allows them to take Golan territory at the end of the day. That would be defeated. It would be clear that the United States is on the side of Israel staying on the Golan Heights permanently. And I think it would deter aggression rather than stimulate it.
I agree with you. Dr. Duran, let me go to you now with a similar but expanded question. What impact would U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights have pertaining specifically to Russia and Iran?
It would send a message to all parties, including the Russians and the Iranians, about what the United States expects the new Syria to look like. The Russians and the Iranians are working hard to create a Syria that is going to be a Russian and Iranian base of operations in the whole region. And this is one way that we can very powerfully say to them and to the Syrians that we don't accept that and that we have a different vision of the new Syria. And it would also condition our talks with the Syrian people and the Syrian governments in the future. You know, it was noted that the previous Israeli prime ministers sat down with the Syrian representatives and entertained the possibility of returning to the 4 June 1967 line. Those talks were not simply bilateral Israeli-Syrian talks. Those were talks by the Syrians with the Israelis, very much with the intention of influencing Washington. And so Washington would be sending a message to the Syrians that if you want, to the future Syrian governments, if you want good relations with the United States and you want to sit down comfortably with the American-led order, it means accepting the Golan in the Golan as part of Israel, and we would strengthen the Israeli governments. We would strengthen the backbone of Israeli governments, and we would take off of the agenda the possibility of rolling back Israel.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Few questions. Just doing a little bit of a check here. It looks like the Golan Heights is would be the equivalent of 24 square miles. I mean, 24 miles by 24 miles. I shouldn't say about 500 square miles. How many people live in that area right now? Does anyone know?
About 50,000.
50,000 people. And who lives there, if you had to describe them ethnically?
It's 30,000 Jews and 20,000 Druze.
Okay. No Arab, no traditional Arabs or
No,
non-Jews Arabs?
Virtually none.
Okay. Could you describe the economy of the Golan Heights?
It's overwhelmingly based on tourism. There's also agriculture, and now there are some clean energy industries being explored.
Could you describe the economy today compared to the economy 50 years ago?
The economy is vastly more developed. It's accessible to tourists. All of the infrastructure in the area has been developed by Israel since 1967.
Could you compare the economy of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights to the Golan Heights immediately adjacent to it?
The Syrian Golan Heights is now principally a battleground between different rebel groups and themselves, and between rebel groups and Assad. It's a desolate wasteland.
I would say, could you describe the quality of agriculture on the area controlled by Israel compared to the area controlled by Syria?
The Israeli side produces internationally recognized very fine wines. It's also the major source of Israeli beef stock.
Look a lot greener on the Israeli side?
It's a lot greener, and it's quite beautiful.
Why is that?
Because of the quality of the agriculture, the quality of the irrigation, and the lack of a prolonged ethnic cleansing process.
Okay. The people who previously were, obviously Syria has a problem that they are made up of a lot of ethnic groups, don't get along. The people who have left the Golan, how would you describe their ethnicity?
The Druze on the Golan?
The ones who left.
So very few Druze left during the war. The Six-Day War ended too fast for anyone to really
Were there any
run away.
Did any people leave the Golan?
No, it was not a source of refugees.
Okay, so the same people are living there now who basically lived there 50 years ago.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Is there anything that could be done kind of short of full recognition that would be a step in that direction?
Several steps could be taken. Encouraging congressional delegations to visit is a simple step. Putting in the foreign aid budget for Israel an explicit permission for Israel to use money appropriated to it for defense and other purposes in the Golan Heights. Encouraging the creation of defense and research projects, joint defense and research projects in the Golan Heights, and modifying the U.S.-Israel joint science research agreements to explicitly allow the use of funds for research on agriculture and clean energy in the Golan Heights.
It seems to me a lot of anti-Israeli feeling in this country is focused on this boycott, divest, sanctions effort. How do they use the Golan Heights? How does this effort use the Golan Heights?
The Golan Heights is completely subject to efforts of economic warfare against Israel, while the BDS movement claims that their goal is Palestinian self-determination. The boycott aspect is applied 100% to the Golan, where there is no question of Palestinian self-determination. Crucially, United Nations resolutions that seek to promote economic strangleholds on Israeli territories apply to the Golan. EU labeling policies apply to the Golan, and there is no distinction made, even though there is no claim of self-determination or a right to statehood in this area.
Okay. Anybody else can jump in, too. Anybody trying to leave? I mean, you said we have 30,000 Israeli Jews in there and 20,000 Druze, is that right? Anybody trying to leave? Anybody unhappy that Israel's running it right now?
No, they're not unhappy. You only need to look at what's going on in Syria and see that they don't want to trade their status in Israel for Syrian citizenship.
Or Jordan or Lebanon?
Or Jordan or Lebanon, but
Nobody's
they have Syrian citizenship if they have kept their Syrian citizenship if they want to. Younger people are accepting Israeli citizenship, which is on offer, but those who haven't accepted Israeli citizenship are not doing it because they necessarily prefer Syrian citizenship. They've done it because there is a question mark over the status of the Golan, and it might go back to Assad. And if they choose Israeli citizenship over Syrian and it goes citizenship and it goes back to Assad, then they and their families fear retribution.
Okay. Guess I've used my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. It's an issue that I've been very interested in for a long time, so this is a very timely and important issue. In fact, in the last Congress, I introduced House Resolution 768, expressing the sense of the House that it's in the U.S. national security interest for Israel to maintain control of the Golan Heights. So this has been a great testimony that we've all provided. I appreciate that. But I do want to focus in more than we have so far on Iran and Iran's designs. We've talked a little bit about the land bridge, and that's been helpful. Has the status quo changed? Ambassador Kurtzer, you mentioned the status quo. For 50-some years, Israel has been maintaining a status quo, you say, and a happy status quo. I've heard that phrase, but haven't things changed? Ambassador Gold or Dr. Duran, with Iran's involvement in the Syrian civil war, Iran's stated intentions to find ways to annihilate Israel, not that that language has changed, but their ability to do so, or harm Israel at least, has changed due to their proximity now to the Golan Heights and their involvement in Syria, their involvement in Lebanon. So for the two of you, could you comment on whether the status quo has changed to the point where the U.S. policy should change?
Well, one issue which I did raise is Iranian planning. And the fact of the matter is that the Iranians are planning on building a very large army. Now, these Shiite militias are trained and equipped by Iran and deployed in Syria. The goal, according to General Soleimani himself, is to get to 150,000 men. Now remember, Israel does not keep the whole Israeli army on the Golan Heights. It has a small blocking force. The number of soldiers it puts there is classified. But after 48 hours, we get to full mobilization, and then we can withstand an attack. Now, if there is a massive Iranian force in the next 5 to 6 years that develops in Syria, that plans to attack Israel, Israel's dependence on the Golan Heights and the initial terrain conditions that the Golan presents to Israel will become more vital. One of the witnesses that was supposed to appear here was General Giora Island, and he was the mastermind, the architect.
If you could summarize, because I'm running out of time.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying there's no alternative to Israeli military presence on the Golan Heights, enshrined, protected diplomatically by Israeli sovereignty.
And by U.S. recognition of that sovereignty?
And U.S. recognition of that sovereignty, that would be the strongest defense of Israel in the international community.
And Dr. Duran, if you could answer that, but throw in the following thought. Has relations between Israel and the neighboring friendly Arab states, given Iran's threats that have united this sort of ad hoc coalition, has that changed the status quo as well?
It's totally changed the status quo. And there are, I think, three major factors at work here that make the map of the Middle East today totally different than when UN Resolution 242 was issued. One is the rise of the Iranians. The second is the question mark about American power. The United States has downgraded the Middle East somewhat in its foreign policy, and everyone in the region wonders how much has it been downgraded. And the third thing is the near disintegration of Syria. And so I think I leave it to Professor Kantorovich to say whether this is a valid legal principle, but I think it should be a principle of our policy that the entity that was in Syria when UN Resolution 242 was issued is no longer there. When we're negotiating with the Assad regime now, behind it is Syria. I mean, behind it is Iran. Behind it is Russia. This is not an entity like Egypt that can make a guarantee about the borders of Syria that we can rely on in any serious respect. So if we're holding this in escrow for this entity to take over, the entity's not there anymore. I don't know if that's a legal principle, but it should be a policy principle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to give Ambassador Kurtzer a chance to respond to some of the points that were made. In listening to your testimony, as I understood it, Israel does have a secure position on the Golan now. There's no suggestion that that be taken away, and that there would be, as you saw it, a number of collateral consequences to an annexation. And I'm sorry that I missed some of the questioning as I was out at another hearing, but I'd welcome your response to some of the points that were made.
Thank you, Congressman. The reality right now is that no one is seriously questioning Israel's control of this territory, and we have not questioned that control since 1967. And there's a distinction then between the issue of sovereignty and the issue of control. The United States, I think, in a bipartisan and very serious way, has supported Israel's right to defend itself. We need to continue to do that. I think some of the things mentioned by Professor Kantorovich in terms of ways of enhancing our relationship with Israel should definitely be considered by the Congress. But that's a far cry from changing the subject to a question of sovereignty. Today, Israel is on the high ground, both literally, physically, but also diplomatically and morally. And it's, as a result of that, has gained a tremendous amount of support internationally, including in the region, for what it's doing to counteract malign Iranian influence. Why change the subject now to this question, a legal question, which is not on anybody's agenda? And it does not enhance American foreign policy to be changing the agenda at this point.
You mentioned that Israel has significant improvement in relations with a number of the Arab states. And could you elaborate on your view as to how this would complicate that progress?
Look, right now, most of the improved relations between Israel and the states with which it does not have a peace treaty are conducted behind the curtain. There's intelligence cooperation, strategic cooperation, a great deal of political dialogue. Most of these countries would be unwilling to come out from behind that curtain in support of a claim of sovereignty. They have their own domestic audiences, the so-called Arab Street. I do not suggest that a recognition of sovereignty would bring people into the street. There's not going to be major demonstrations or violence, but it would force Arab states to take positions against Israel at a time when they're working with Israel on Israel's important security interests as well as their own security interests.
Okay. One final question. I've always appreciated what I thought was the United States' role of trying to be a peacemaker and the honest broker. There's some people who see some of the decisions, like the unilateral move of the capital to Jerusalem, supported by many people here, but not by everyone, as compromising the capacity of the U.S. to play that role. Do you see any issue related to the U.S. pushing sovereignty complicating its role ultimately to be a collaborative player in a peace process in the region?
I think there's no question, Congressman. Look, we've seen, with respect to the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, how it's complicated the American role in the peace process that the President has said he wants to resolve. Palestinians are not talking to us. It's true they didn't burn down an embassy, they didn't riot, but they've taken themselves out of the game, and they've said that the United States is not an honest broker. By the U.S. recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights at a moment when it's not part of the discourse, it's not part of the diplomacy, would force Arab states also to distance themselves from U.S. leadership, which is critical at this very difficult period in the region.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank our witnesses again for appearing for us today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.